Again, let me just say good evening and welcome to everyone. I'm Elizabeth von Hassel. I'm the Executive Director of the National Sporting Library Museum in Middleburg, Virginia. And thank you for joining the NSLM and the Piedmont Environmental Council this evening for Go Native. We're so excited to partner with groups like the PEC who share our mission and our love of the land and our waterways that surround us. I'm also pleased to welcome those of you joining us for the very first time this evening. Let me extend a warm welcome to our NSLM and our PEC members also. Thank you so very much for your dedicated support to both of our organizations. I also would be remiss if I just didn't take a moment and take advantage of this opportunity to thank so many thoughtful attendees that we have this evening for their individual commitment to the conservation of garden and landscape. When I look at some of the names here this evening that are joining us, many of you have clearly been the trendsetters in this area. Your contributions to design, conservation of gardens and large landscape have had a significant and positive impact on the environment. So thank you so much for your dedication and support in making the world a much better place to live. And we're so excited to be partnering with PEC. I have many friends over the years with the PEC, so it's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure for us at the NSLM. And we're partnering again on April 29th for a talk, Brook Trout, Gems of Piedmont. So we hope that you all, if you enjoy this evening, please sign up for that program. You can do that online. We'd love to see you again. The NSLM is the only museum and library that's dedicated to the preservation, the protection, and education of traditional field sports, and that would include wing shooting, equestrian sports, and of course, angling. We're also very strongly committed to educating and advocating for the conservation of waterways, open space, and landscape, including the wonderful and impactful ways that going native in our very own backyards benefit the environment. So I'd also like to invite all of you to please come out and see our current exhibitions at the NSLM. We have Phyllis Mills Wyeth, a celebration, a thrill of the chase, which is steeplechase in arch, and they actually close this month. So please feel free to explore our galleries virtually. We have with so many conservationists online, I'd like to point out too that we have two really stunning exhibitions coming up. Many of you may be familiar with this wonderful museum out in Jackson Hole, the National Museum of Wildlife Art. So we will be having partnering with them on Tucker Smith, The Celebration of Nature. That is a retrospective exhibition of animal and landscape imagery. It's going to be on loan from that museum. That will be fabulous. We also have coming up in June, hopefully, as with everything opening up a little bit more, an outside exhibition, Walter Mattia. It's interesting, just this one is entitled Field Notes, so wonderful wildlife sculpture that will be presented and exhibited outside. So the partnership between the NSLM and PEC broaden our combined mission reach, allow us to share in celebrating our environment, and actually to be advocates for the land that sustains us. We count ourselves really lucky to have such a strong and long-standing relationship with our friends over the PEC. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening the president of the Piedmont Environmental Council. He's my sometimes fishing buddy, very long-time friend. Let me welcome Chris Miller. Good evening.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you so much to the National Sporting Library. You guys have been wonderful partners for many years. Elizabeth, you've been a great friend and a colleague and on so many projects across a broad spectrum of historic preservation and conservation. And I can't thank you enough for everything you're doing to support our work, and we look forward to doing what we can to support you, though I'm sure you're much better at supporting us than we are you.
I don't know about that. I've been fishing with you, Chris.
Well, you're certainly a better fisherwoman. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to provide some context on why PEC is so involved with landscape and native plants. Most people know us for our work on conservation, but we are very, very committed to work on habitat and native plants as part of that landscape. And I'm so excited that Celia Vuocolo will be able to present her work over the past 3 years and our work over a longer period to try to develop those programs and bring them throughout the region. And I want to show you just a couple of big picture images and then turn it over to Celia. Just a quick reminder, if you have questions as we go along, you can create a chat. It's either on the bottom of your screen right now, or if you're got a full screen and you don't see it, there's a tab up at the top that says view options. And if you pull that down, you can go escape full screen and the chat will show back up. The advantage there is that you'll be able to leave questions and then address them to Valerie. She'll be collating them, and then we'll be getting those questions at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentations, there'll also be a drawing for special prizes, and very exciting, so stay tuned. Next slide, Margot. PEC works in 9 counties. It's a big area, actually. It's 2.27 million acres and quite a large tract of land. We work in areas from urban to very rural, wilderness. And so that gives us a pretty good transect of different habitats and different topographies. And over the years, we've gained a lot of experience from that. Next slide. It's our mission, our role in the region is very simple. It's to engage you as residents and landowners and citizens, help educate you about what we know about conservation, about land use, other issues, and then try to find ways to empower individuals and communities to do things to make the world a better place. It's a very simple construct. Very bold and aspirational vision is to try to protect 1 million acres, which is roughly 50% of the rural area. Interestingly, it's consistent with emerging understandings, the Nature Conservancy and others, that to preserve nature, we need to preserve 30% of the land and water area. So we have a little bit bolder goal of 50% because we're a place where that can happen. But what we're really excited about is that the state, the partnership of states and federal agencies that work in the Chesapeake Bay, and now national policies are starting to recognize that that's the scale we need to be thinking. This map on the center is where those 1 million acres might be. The dark green are the lands that are already protected. If we go to the next slide, this is a little crisper image of the land that is protected already. It's about 427,000 acres of private land and about 125,000 acres of public land. Most of that's in the Shenandoah National Park, Sky Meadow, a couple of wildlife management areas. So mostly a private landscape that's been conserved by you and by our beneficiaries for a long time, and 50 years of work has produced something pretty spectacular. Next slide. But when you get right down to it, it's what we do on the land that has a huge impact. Conserving it is a first step. Learning how better ways of land management is the next. This is a wonderful photograph of a restored meadow. It shows what can happen if we put our minds to it in terms of creating a mix of native wildlife, native wildflowers and sedges and grasses, all of which support many species. And that's the beat of this presentation. Next slide. But what we're as an organization committed to is trying to link the wilderness natural areas that are in the Shenandoah National Park along the Blue Ridge, which is one of the largest forest restoration projects on the East Coast, begun back in the 1930s when they created the park, and try to extend that restoration and habitat management along corridors and tie back into our suburban and urban environments. Next slide. The potential for this is great. This is the protected land just within the Goose Creek watershed, which the Sporting Library is part of. And it's approaching 40% protected lands. And the challenge now is to make sure that we do whatever we can to manage those properties so that we're providing habitat for native wildlife and try to extend the protections of the forested areas in the Blue Ridge downstream and towards suburban Loudoun. And even there, you think that's a wasteland and a lost cause, but it really isn't. If you, this is a map of the area just west of Dulles, and it's both the suburban zone of Loudoun County and the transition area. And this is an area that is, homeowners associations of 1,500 acres. And the orange in the map are the parts of the homeowners associations that are managed as common open space. These are highly landscaped. They're spending lots of money on it. And the theory here is to get them to spend money on the right plants. If they're using those areas for native habitat, then we're bringing that wilderness wildlife potential back into the suburbs. So it's pretty exciting at the big scale. Lots of enthusiasm. What you learn from Celia is being heard all over the region. It's being incorporated in the county comprehensive plans. This last slide is the concept of the emerald ribbons that the Loudoun County is starting to work on. That's both a public access corridors and wild wilderness natural corridors. And so starting to see recognition here and in Albemarle and other counties that we really have to plan for native habitat as much as we plan for development. So, what we're trying to do is think about how we can each individually contribute, but then how that can be part of a connected landscape and lead to transformational change. It's very attainable. Just takes a little bit of effort. The potential in a place like Middleburg, this is an aerial view of Middleburg looking west. It's just about 15 miles to the Blue Ridge. So think about how the scenic byways, the rivers, streams, even along the roads themselves, we can create connected habitat. Think of what trees we plant along Main Street and what we plant at the Sporting Library. If those trees and shrubs are chosen carefully, they themselves become habitat for wildlife. So I'm gonna stop there. Much more fun to talk to Celia, who's done this from soup to nuts and is an expert on bees and pollinators and plants. We're so excited about her role at PEC. She manages our habitat programs. She's a former park ranger, a naturalist, an incredible thought leader, and got more energy than most folks could dream of having. She's done so many different pieces of this, very much hands-on and in terms of the theory and thought about policy. So without further ado, here's Celia Vuocolo.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great introduction. And thanks to the National Sporting Library and Elizabeth for inviting us. Really appreciate it. As Chris mentioned, my name is Celia, and I'm the Wildlife Habitat and Stewardship Specialist with PEC. I've been with PEC for about 7 years now and oversee our habitat program. I'm also the co-chair for the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives campaign, which you'll be hearing more about in a little bit. And without further ado, let's see here. Oh, sorry, forgot to, here we go. Now it'll move, I think. Oops. Okay, here is a brief overview of today's talk, but my goal this evening is for you all to leave this presentation feeling inspired and determined to help protect and restore our local biodiversity by going native. You'll see that a little bit can really go a long way. When I think about our habitat program, there's one common thread that runs through it: the conservation of native plants. Native plants are plants that have evolved with our ecosystems over millions of years. Over millions of years, and they are indigenous to our environment. Because they've been a part of our landscape for so long, animal species have developed and co-evolved with them, creating special relationships, some so special that they cannot exist without the other. Native plants are the building blocks of wildlife habitat, but they also clean water and hold soil. They provide food and are forage for livestock. They provide us with enjoyment, peace of mind, and a sense of place. They are the fabric that holds our world together. As I was developing this presentation, I opened up a copy of Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, looking for some inspiration. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you go out tomorrow and find yourself a copy. He had signed the first page, as he often does, at one of the many speaking events of his that I've gone to over the years, and his inscription really struck me. It's such a simple statement, but holds so much value and urgency, because life does depend on how we garden, how we care for our backyards and our landscapes. Scientists like Tallamy have been amplifying this message of urgency over the past 5 years with new and startling research. One of the most crushing reports on biodiversity loss came just last year when a Smithsonian report found that almost 3 billion birds, or 1 in 4 birds, has been lost from North America since 1970. This is a loss that has occurred not just within one species group, but across a broad spectrum of species, with diverse habitat preferences and life histories, and has been a rallying cry for the conservation community. 2017 saw the first headline in what the media has dubbed the insect apocalypse. This was due to a German paper that found that in 30 years, 80% of flying insects had disappeared from German nature preserves. The cause was unknown, but researchers hypothesized that heavy development and land use change directly surrounding the nature preserves probably played a major role. This created a wave of concern, with more research gaining more media attention, including a 2019 study that saw about 40% of insect species are declining worldwide. And lastly, we have the ongoing 6th mass extinction event, which we believe is driving massive global biodiversity losses. Just to give you some perspective, the last extinction event occurred with the die-off of the dinosaurs. And extinction events are broadly characterized as being caused by a significant environmental event and ending with the loss of over 3/4 of the species from the planet. Typically during one of these events, species are lost over the course of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, which then gives new species time to evolve and move in. However, the 6th mass extinction event is significant because the rate of species loss is happening at such an accelerated rate that it outpaces the ability for new species to evolve. And it's pretty clear that human impacts on the environment are what is causing it. So let's consider Doug Tallamy's quote again. Life does really depend on how we choose to garden. I'd like to share a story of my own backyard garden with you. It starts with the native coral honeysuckle vine that grows on the side of my garden shed. For anyone who isn't familiar with this species, it's a beautiful, fast-growing vine, which is native, does well on a trellis, and is a fantastic hummingbird plant. It begins blooming in early April and flowers all the way to October. Anyway, I noticed a caterpillar on it this past spring, which is the larva for the snowberry clearwing moth. Coral honeysuckle is one of the larval host plants for this species, meaning that this moth's caterpillars have evolved to feed off the leaves of this plant and a few others. So this plant essentially acts as a nursery for these caterpillars. A few weeks later, I noticed that particular caterpillar. I went out to look at a patch of wild bergamot during one of my computer breaks from work, and found both the adult snowberry clearwing and its close cousin, hummingbird clearwing moth. They are both hawk moths and really curious looking creatures if you haven't seen them before. Sometimes they're confused for actual hummingbirds because their wings beat so fast. They have a long proboscis or tongue that is perfectly designed to get at the nectar from the long corollas of flowers like wild bergamot, its cousin bee balm, coral honeysuckle, phlox, etc. This specialized morphology is just one important example of the relationship between native plants and pollinators. Taking it back in time a little bit, bees split off from wasps when they began to specialize feeding pollen and nectar to their larvae, as opposed to insect prey, a wasp behavior trait, which was about 100 million years ago. Bees began to diversify at the same time that flowering plants did, which is shown as this gray funnel that's on the left side of the chart here. We began seeing fossil specimens of bees with pollen around 140 million years ago, which is shown by the small dotted line there on the screen. There is a direct link between flowering plant evolution and bee evolution, meaning that they drove the evolution of each other's physical characteristics. What this looks like today is a concept called pollinator syndromes, or as I like to call it, who likes what? Flowers and bees were figuring each other out over millions of years, and all that work led to mutually beneficial relationships between pollinators and plants. Flowers that relied on pollinators to reproduce developed physical traits that either provided access to their pollen or nectar for the right pollinator or blocked access to inefficient pollinators. And all of this was determined by the likelihood of that particular pollinator to be successful in assisting in the flower's reproduction strategy. So if you're following me here, I just want to show the two columns that I've extracted from the chart that compare and contrast the differences in strategies that flowers have with attracting the right pollinator for the right job. Look at the column for butterflies on the left. The plants that want to attract butterflies are bright red and purple, usually speaking, provide visual petal nectar guides, and offer abundant nectar. Contrast that with flies, whose flower preferences have evolved to have brown or dark purple flowers with kind of a putrid scent, think skunk cabbage, which mimic dead tissue and have no nectar, since flies are primarily just interested in the pollen. There is a type of bee which exists across all bee families that has the most specialized kind of plant relationship. We call these species pollen specialist bees. These bees only collect pollen from certain plants, some so specific that they may only collect pollen from just one or two species of plants. Their life cycle is timed with the life cycle of that plant, and if their host plant is not present in a particular area, they won't be either. We have 75 species of specialist bees in the mid-Atlantic, and one of these species, Andrena erigene, the native mining bee, pictured here, will be making its appearance soon. This bee is a forest dweller because it collects pollen from just two species of spring beauties, which are delicate woodland ephemeral flowers. I guarantee that if you go on a woodland flower walk early spring coming up and come upon this plant and there's a bee present, it's probably going to be this little fellow. Here's another example. This is Melisodes denticulata, which is a specialist on New York ironweed. This bee belongs to the family Apidae, and its sisters are carpenter bees and bumblebees and honeybees. Bees in this family are kind of broadly characterized as being big-bodied and furry. And I actually like to think of this guy as wearing a pair of fuzzy chaps. Anyway, this bee emerges at about the same time that ironweed flowers in the late summer. And we all know that ironweed is a pretty common field plant in the Piedmont, but it's actually quite important because of this intricate relationship with the specialist bee. Specialist bees are at some of the highest risks for extinction of all the bee species due to effects from climate change, which can alter the bloom time of plants. And of course, habitat destruction. I always recommend that gardeners who are interested in supporting pollinators consider plants that support specialist bees. And I've got a list of these plants that I can send out to the group following this program if folks are interested. So the pollinator-plant relationship is just one of the many important attributes of our native plants. But let's say that the caterpillar's fate went a different way. Putting pollination aside, insects are crucial to our natural food webs because they are an important link in the flow of energy. Energy from the sun is harnessed by plants, which are then consumed by insect herbivores, which make up 37% of Earth's animals. And virtually every animal species eats insects. Insects are 25% of the red fox's diet. And a whopping 96% of the bird species in North America feed caterpillars to their young. Our backyard birds rely on caterpillars and other insects to sustain their populations. Let me provide you with an example of this. Something else I noticed last spring in the coral honeysuckle was a cardinal nest. Naturally, it got me thinking, how many clearwing caterpillars would two baby cardinals need? Unfortunately, after some digging, I found out the cardinals carry their food to their young, all matched up and way back in their bill. So there's no way to know what exactly they're bringing to the nest. But I can extrapolate that the number of trips to the nest the parents take, knowing that each trip means that they are bringing back insects. So I can get an idea of how many insects are needed for this one clutch of eggs. So bear with me a moment through my calculations. An average clutch size for a cardinal is 3 to 4 eggs. Parent birds will feed about 3 to 4 young about 5 to 6 times an hour. So you figure that for my nest of 2 eggs, they make maybe 4 trips an hour. In order to estimate the number of trips needed to rear my one clutch of nestlings, let's multiply 4 trips by 8 hours of foraging time a day times 10 days, which gives us 320 trips. It's a lot of caterpillars. And you have to figure too that, like I said, every time they come back, maybe they're bringing 1 caterpillar or 4 beetles or 2 lacewings, whatever it is. Then imagine that this is just one nest and think of all the birds in your backyard that you see at your house, and then on your block, and then in your town, etc. It's a lot of mouths to feed. This is another great Doug Tallamy quote, and I am going to be quoting him a couple times this evening because he just has such a way with words. But I really want to emphasize this point because the cardinal, the mining bee, the snowberry clearwing, the wild bergamot, and the coral honeysuckle, they are all part of the same network of interactions that happens every day in your own backyard. The importance of bringing native plants into our own backyards cannot be overstated. Tallamy also says that if half of American lawns were replaced with native plants, we could create the equivalent of a 20 million acre national park, 9 times bigger than Yellowstone or 100 times bigger than Shenandoah National Park. To put this into perspective, consider this map of US land ownership. The purple areas are federal lands and the rest is either private or state or county owned land. In the East, the majority of our lands fall into this last category. So biodiversity conservation work cannot happen without the cooperation of private landowners. Here's PEC's region. Publicly owned land, which in this case, we've included federal, state, and county lands, make up only 6.5% of our region. This places the onus of wildlife conservation directly in the hands of private landowners. And conservation easements help protect land while keeping it in private hands and create opportunities for enhancing and connecting wildlife habitat through protected corridors. And here in the East, a lot of privately owned land is increasingly parcelized, fragmented, and degraded. PEC's region, for example, sits close to one of the most heavily populated areas of the country. The Piedmont of Virginia is a crucial landscape, and promoting native gardens, land stewardship, and restoration can provide important habitat for many species. However, we are faced with several challenges. Habitat fragmentation and habitat loss are arguably the biggest threat to biodiversity on the planet. So much of our landscape looks like this: small wild or forested areas that are surrounded by roads and development, which form sinks for isolated wildlife populations. This is especially a problem for species that have low reproductive rates and are also susceptible to vehicle strikes, like the eastern box turtle, whose entire territory is roughly a 1/4 square mile. Or the landscape looks like this: disconnected forest blocks and overgrazed fields. Note some of the brown areas in the photo here, which are exposed ground in the pastures. I'd like to mention, though, that PEC and our partners at Smithsonian's Virginia Working Landscapes program are working with farmers through our Piedmont Grassland Bird Initiative to help them employ sustainable farming and grazing practices that benefit grassland bird species. Habitat loss is a big issue, and a good chunk of our landscape has little to no value for wildlife. Unfortunately, this is not an ecologically productive landscape. Mowed lawns and non-native landscape plantings create what I call green deserts. Very few species can subsist in a landscape like this. Invasive species are another big threat to biodiversity, next to habitat fragmentation and loss. Non-native plants, for instance, outcompete our native plants and have little to no value for wildlife. They can also be destructive and cause property damage, like the kudzu shown in this photo. This is a question that keeps us biologists up at night. And I think it comes down to one big issue that creates several subsequent problems, which is lack of awareness. We are so used to our landscapes and backyards looking a certain way, which tends to be overly manicured and or dominated by non-native exotic plants, that we think that that's how things have always looked. Fighting nature blindness and providing opportunities for education and demonstration sites that show what a native landscape looks like is the key to changing our landscape aesthetic. Finding natives for purchase is another major barrier for getting more habitat on the ground. Without consumers, there won't be a big supply, so we need to hit that sweet spot where consumers are driving plant inventory. In the Piedmont and in Northern Virginia, we are lucky to have a handful of wonderful but small native plant nurseries. However, most people pop into the closest retail nursery on the weekend, which tends to be Home Depot or something similar, and have this to choose from. By looking at this photo, I can guarantee that 95% of the plants here, maybe even 100%, are non-native. But without a strong market for natives, big box stores are not going to be keen to carry more of them. Some of our county, state, and agency policies and regulations do not favor the use of native plants on roadsides and government properties, or downright oppose naturalized landscapes. The Virginia Department of Transportation is the largest landowner in the Commonwealth. How they choose to enhance or suppress native plants on their roadside has an impact on local wildlife populations. Additionally, our roadsides harbor many invasive plant species, and this allows them to easily travel into new areas. This is the last challenge, but perhaps the trickiest one. It takes a long time to change the status quo, and it takes a large percentage of our society to buy into a new way of doing things to really affect change. Our love affair with lawns has its roots in European culture, when we brought the concept of the English garden and landscaping to the New World. It's $1 million industry. But I think we need to reconsider how we are spending our time and money, and also realize that nature can't happen someplace else anymore. Lawns are designed to push nature away from homes, but we are at the point where we pushed it so far that it has no place left to go. So with that, I'd like to share some solutions that PEC, our partners, and many homeowners around the region have been implementing to let nature back in. Controlling invasives. I can't wait until my daughter is a little bit older. She's 3 right now and can help me yank out the English ivy that's taking over our little backyard forest at home. But learning what is invasive, what is native, and just plain non-native in your property is probably one of the most important first steps. Education and outreach. This is big. Education happens on all sorts of different levels. One-on-one with your neighbor, attending a talk like this, working with your local soil and water conservation district on practices, volunteering in a citizen science project. It all makes a difference. So much of what I do and what PEC does broadly is focused on outreach and education. Community engagement and empowerment is important to creating social change. But people also need a place to go to see what a native plant landscape looks like, and demonstration sites are the best way for people to truly understand how native plants can be arranged together and the types of wildlife they can attract and support. PEC either owns or has helped create at least 15 public demonstration sites around our region. I believe that everyone should have access to one of these educational sites within driving distance of where they live. At PEC's headquarters in Warrenton, we have transformed our 3/4 acre lot into the Larson Native Plant Garden. We host workshops and walks that showcase the work that we've done there. And actually, we will be hosting some garden walks on April 22nd this year, which is Earth Day, for Historic Garden Week, if you'd like to stop by. We've installed over 100 species of native plants, which includes different sizes of trees, shrubs, ferns, grasses, ground covers, and perennials. The idea behind the Larson Garden is to show what's possible in a suburban urban setting when gardening with native plants. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the Piedmont Memorial Overlook, which is a 50-acre PEC conservation property that sits right next to Sky Meadows State Park in Paris. The open area that you can see here is our 17-acre restored native wildflower meadow. Our meadow hosts 15 species of wildflowers and 3 species of native grasses. It supports a wide variety of pollinators and shrubland and grassland birds like indigo buntings, yellow-breasted chats, and I've even seen a bobwhite quail or 2 there. We also have a healthy woodcock population on the property as well. I use the overlook to show landowners that are interested in managing their land for wildlife what options are available for them. And I share a restoration story, which has had some ups and downs. It's a really special spot though, and the public can freely access it from Sky Meadows State Park and the Appalachian Trail. Educational information goes hand in hand with touring demonstration sites. EEC and our partners have developed a lot of outreach material to help landowners, both big and small, gain a better understanding of how to best steward their land. For example, these 2 guides provide information on everything from native plant to selection to how to manage grasslands for bird habitat. The guide on the left is the Piedmont Native Plant Guide, which was developed by a group of folks, myself included, and it showcases native plants of the Piedmont region that are appropriate for use in gardens and small landscapes. The guide can be purchased through the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District, the Virginia Native Plant Society online, and if you're interested in purchasing it from PEC, we also have it, and you can pick it up at either our Warrenton or Charlottesville office, but I would just say to contact me first to arrange for pickup since our offices are closed due to the pandemic. It's also available online for a free download, which we can pass around after the program. And then the guide on the right is called Managing Land in the Piedmont of Virginia for the Benefits of Birds and Other Wildlife. This was developed by PEC, the American Bird Conservancy, and the Department of Wildlife Resources. You can download this guide from our website or ABC's or DWR's, and we also have paper copies of it for free at the PEC office. This is a big one that I touched on earlier. With increased awareness and education of native plants over the past 15 years or so, supply has increased a little bit, but PEC does work frequently with many of our local native plant nurseries on various restoration projects, outreach programming, but we still see a need to improve supply, particularly with local ecotype plant stock and with Virginia wholesale plant markets. There are also no native seed nurseries in Virginia. This is a big issue because landowners who want to do large-scale restoration projects like our meadow require native seed and have to obtain seed stock from out of state, which means that the seed genetics are often from other regions of the country. However, I will say, if you're looking for local native plant nurseries this spring, I did want to highlight 3 of them that are in our immediate area. So the first is Piedmont Nursery in Markham. The second is Watermark Woods in Waterford. And the third is Hill House Farm and Nursery in Rappahannock. During a normal year, there are also seasonal regional native plant sales that host a variety of vendors. But with COVID restrictions, a lot of them have become limited, but the Virginia Native Plant Society website does have a list of native plant sales if you want to check out to see if there's any in the area. So once private land is protected, there's an incredible opportunity to engage with landowners about stewarding their land. Conservation easements really help to secure a long-term possibility towards better stewardship. And PEC works with landowners every day to help them enhance the conservation benefits of their properties. Privately protected land is key to habitat connectivity and biodiversity resilience in our region. strengthening the conservation potential of these lands by enhancing riparian corridors, by planting native trees, employing sustainable farming practices that benefit grassland wildlife species, and stewarding forest land are all important activities that can improve habitat corridors in our area. This one is complex. The implications for policy change are huge, but it's also will perhaps take the most time to achieve. But in terms of moving the needle on changing social norms, adopting native landscaping friendly practices on government and agency-held land is incredibly important. I mentioned earlier that VDOT is the largest landowner in Virginia. PEC, along with many other groups, organizations, and even other state agencies have been putting pressure on VDOT to adopt integrated vegetation management practices. What this means is we would like them to adopt managing invasive species, planting natives, protecting existing native plant communities, and mowing less. About 2 months ago, VDOT voluntarily entered into a monarch candidate conservation assurance agreement, it's a mouthful, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a national program that aims to keep the monarch butterfly off the endangered species list. Milkweed, the larval host plant for the monarch, is a roadside plant typically, and as the monarchs are migrating to and from Mexico, they rely on roadside habitat to fuel up for their long journey and to also reproduce. Through this program, VDOT has enrolled 8% of their right-of-ways and other parcels, but we want them to do better. VDOT already has a pollinator habitat program in which they create natural areas for native plants. This is an example of a pollinator habitat project at the Dale City Rest Stop along 95 in Prince William County. The Virginia Native Plant Society maintains this site. However, VDOT has only planted 4 of these sites to date, and they have all been at rest stops. So we would like to see them expand and accelerate this program. Lastly, roadsides can sometimes contain the last vestiges of Piedmont plant communities. These plants are not only native, but they have evolved together to create plant communities, which in turn support a very specific suite of vertebrate and invertebrate populations. Oftentimes the plants or animals found in these remnant communities are imperiled and or endangered. This is an example of a Piedmont grassland prairie site found at the corner of Avon Street extended in Route 20, just south of Charlottesville. It was identified by one of PEC's partners, the Center for Urban Habitats. VDOT should also prioritize the protection of remnant sites like these, along with reestablishing natives on roadsides. I'd like to share 2 legislative successes this year that will help accelerate biodiversity protection. The first came with the passing of HJ 527, which mandates that the Virginia Department of Consumer and Agricultural Services, VDACS, and the Department of Conservation and Recreation, DCR, study how to phase out the sale of invasive plants in Virginia. EEC, the Virginia Native Plant Society, the Blue Ridge Prism, the Audubon Society of Northern Virginia, and other groups crafted and pushed for this legislation. Believe it or not, many of the invasive plants that have infested our yards and forests are for sale in the whole horticulture industry. This study will help the state devise an exit plan and strategy that can be used to guide the industry on how to phase out the sale of these plants. The second legislative win occurred last year in 2020 with the passing of the Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. Members of the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridor Collaborative, which includes PEC, drafted legislation that directs the Department of Wildlife Resources, or DWR, to create a plan that identifies opportunities for creating and or protecting corridors that will enhance habitat and also allow for safe movement of wildlife across roads in areas with high wildlife vehicle mortality rates. Additionally, PEC is partnering with Albemarle County through the collaborative on a wildlife corridor project that seeks to connect large forest blocks in the southern Albemarle Mountains by improving existing road stream crossings along Route 29 and also enhancing adjacent properties for wildlife habitat and connectivity. We know that financial incentives are a key motivator for landowners when embarking on land stewardship projects. PEC works to promote and protect many important incentives programs on the state level, including the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. VCAP is available through your local soil and water conservation district. For the Middleburg area, that would be the John Marshall Soil and Water Conservation District, which is headquartered in Warrenton. VCAP offers financial assistance in the form of a partial reimbursement for a suite of practices that address stormwater management issues for homeowners. Some of these practices include rain gardens, conservation landscaping with native plants, green roofs, and bioretention, among others. So much of our conservation work would not be possible without the help of our partners. Strong partnerships are crucial and a cornerstone of everything that PEC does. I had a really hard time picking out just one project to highlight, but I thought I would continue along with talking about PEC's demonstration sites. So I would like to showcase our restoration work at Roundabout Meadows. Roundabout Meadows is located at Gilbert's Corner in southern Loudoun County, as most of you know. And we've been busy restoring the 141-acre property to enhance farming and natural resource benefits since around 2014. This particular partnership between PEC, George Mason University, Virginia Native Plant Society, and the Fauquier and Loudoun Garden Club is focused on recording the plant life on a 7-acre wetland site that we excluded livestock from in 2016. In contrast with our restored meadow at the Overlook, we allowed this site to restore naturally on its own. In 2020, Dr. Andrea Weeks, pictured here, led George Mason graduate and undergraduate students in inventorying vascular plant species that were found in the wetland area. We will use her findings to understand the progress of natural regeneration over time. The Wetland Reserve can be accessed by the public via our Old Carolina Road Trail. The trailhead is located near the parking lot of Mount Zion Historic Park. And the wetlands area is a really fantastic birding spot. I just thought I would mention in case we have any birders with us here tonight. If you'll recall back to the beginning of the presentation, Chris showed a slide on the 3 key points that PEC focuses on: engage, empower, and educate. Empowering the individual is probably the most important thing that we can do. And we've learned today that just one individual or one backyard can make a big difference. Learning about native plants, engaging your neighbors, becoming a leader in your HOA community, all of it leads to social change. And that's the big picture here. We want this generation and the next to be able to move the needle forward with protecting and conserving our wild spaces before they are lost. And all the solutions that I've just presented to you can be condensed and distilled into one cohesive concept that I've been working on since 2019, which is the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives campaign. This project has been around since 2015, but we gave it a little push over the last few years. I oversee this campaign along with Beth Mizell, who is the new program director for the Blue Ridge Prison. And Beth and I have worked to secure partner groups and volunteers from across the region to harness educational tools and techniques to spread the good word on planting natives. The Northern Piedmont Natives campaign is one of 9 regional campaigns that make up the Commonwealth. Some of the campaigns in the West haven't been formalized yet, while some of the campaigns in the East were some of the first to take shape in Virginia. And these campaigns go beyond just providing outreach. They've developed initiatives like working directly with local retail nurseries to carry more natives and better label and promote the ones they already have. So it's a multifaceted effort. So I'm not sure if your head is spinning yet, but mine is. There's a lot to do, of course, but keep in mind that this is part of a larger goal. And every step along the way helps improve habitat connectivity on a larger scale. No matter where you live, adding native plants to your landscape can help connect habitat, which assists all kinds of species move across the landscape. And why is this important? Well, it assists with migration, mating, young dispersal, food access, and for animals seeking refuge from climate events. As impacts from climate change intensify and storm, drought, and heat events become more common, many wildlife species are particularly vulnerable if they can't seek new habitat. In short, wildlife needs to be able to move safely and efficiently. So what can you do? Well, I mentioned a lot of things in this presentation already, but some of the big ones that I'd like to just touch on here are learning about what natives and invasives are in your area. Get an understanding of available incentives programs to help you do projects. Engage in different citizen science opportunities and volunteering, and plant native, of course. And you can start as small as you want. My husband and I lived in a townhouse in Gainesville when we first moved to Virginia, and I experimented with growing natives in pots. From right to left, we have Blue Star or Amsonia, and there's Sundrops in the middle, and then Little Blue Stem in the orange pot all the way to the right. I suggest picking natives for pots that do okay in well-drained soils in the wild. They can handle the different levels of moisture fluctuation. Here's the front of our old townhouse. This was about 3 feet deep by 10 feet wide, and I crammed as many plants in as I could, as you can see. In the front with the whitish leaves, that's actually a type of mountain mint called hoary mountain mint. And then behind that is some purple coneflower and then bee balm. Some of you may be familiar with this site. This is the High Line in New York City. Rooftop gardens and walkways, like this one shown here, in urban centers can provide habitat for songbirds and bees, believe it or not. Even within one of the largest cities in the world, insects are still able to find the right flower. So there's no reason why we can't try projects like this in cities a little closer to home. And this is my backyard in the height of summer. In the foreground, you'll see a little bit of Joe Pye weed here, which is a common plant of wet meadows and roadside ditches. And I planted it here in a small rain garden. This is about an acre or so of a restored wet meadow, which is located behind the Orlean Fire Department. This is a public demonstration site that's maintained by the Orlean Community Trail System. And PEC provided funding for its establishment as part of our Thumb Run Watershed Restoration Project in 2017. And I know we didn't spend a ton of time on this today, but riparian corridors reforested with native trees and shrubs are a really key component to landscape connectivity. River and stream corridors provide natural routes for wildlife movement and migration, both aquatic and terrestrial species. PEC and Friends of the Rappahannock's Headwater Stream Initiative program is working to restore riparian buffers and headwater streams in the Upper Rappahannock watershed. Habitat connectivity looks different depending on where you are in the landscape. Here we see a virtual alleyway of native plantings that leads to a forested wetland area. If more HOA communities in our area did this, we could accelerate connectivity almost immediately. Just changing one thing, like adding strips of natives along roads and sidewalks, really alters how a landscape is used, not just by wildlife, but people as well. Areas that are throwaways suddenly have biodiversity value when they didn't before. This changes how we perceive what has potential to be habitat. I like to close out this presentation with some inspiring spotlights on local native plants. All the natives that I'm highlighting can be found at regional native plant nurseries, and I chose them because they do well in a garden or a landscape and have high value for songbirds and pollinators. I also just want to mention that I'll just be touching on these species, and if you're interested in learning more details about them, I would say to check out the Piedmont Natives Guide that I mentioned earlier. And I thought I would start with redbud, since it will soon be in bloom along our roadsides. Most of you are familiar with this tree, but it's a really fantastic flowering tree that would be a great substitute for a non-native cherry tree or Chinese dogwood. It's an important early nectar source for bees, and it hosts 19 species of native caterpillars. This is Winterberry, which I like to call an all seasons plant. It has kind of small, like little nondescript white flowers, but they offer a ton of nectar and pollen and attract all sorts of pollinating insects, including honeybees, for like miles. When I did a citizen science pollinator survey at the PEC office 2 years ago, we counted over 200 honeybees on just 3 of these shrubs one afternoon when they were in full bloom, which tends to happen in the midsummer. Winterberry produces berries that persist through the winter, hence the name, and it's an important food source for birds in the colder months. It also has really great habitat structure, and I find it to be very aesthetically striking in the winter. This is one example of a native viburnum, but there are other ones that you could plant as well. Viburnum offers forage for spring pollinators, it fruits in the late summer and fall, and it also hosts 104 species of native caterpillars. This species in particular, southern arrowwood, likes average to wet soils and like the full sun. Doug Tallamy always says, if you can plant one thing, make it an oak. Unfortunately, we don't all have space for oak trees, but if you do, oaks host the largest amount of caterpillar species in North America, which is 557 species of caterpillars. It's just crazy to me. Oaks are also the cornerstone of our deciduous forests and provide habitat and, of course, acorns for other animals. But as I mentioned, not everyone has space for oak, but they're a great one to choose if you do. So going from a really big plant to a kind of diminutive one, here we have field pussy toes. This is a neat plant that can be used as a ground cover. It puts up tiny little white flowers that look like cat's toes in the springtime, which is where it got its name from. It does best in dry soil, full or part sun, and hosts the fabulous American painted lady butterfly. I took this photo last April at the cemetery at Mount Zion Historic Park near Gilbert's Corner. The mountain mints, they are the true pollinator powerhouses. They always rank really high with how effectively they attract insect pollinators. I call them pollinator party plants because everyone is invited to the party. They aren't true mints, but they can be thugs in the landscape like mints can be. So give them some space. And if you need something to take up a bunch of space, these guys will effectively eat up lawn if you want to get rid of some. There are a couple of different species in our area, and this one in particular, which we have at the office, is Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, or narrowleaf mountain mint. Monarda is a keystone species for bumblebees. Highly recommended for any butterfly or bee garden. It also hosts 3 specialist bees, if you'll recall those guys from earlier in my presentation. It is like mountain mint though, in that it needs space and expands by runners. And also likes full sun, usually average to dry soils. And last but not least, we have our native asters, which are some of my favorites. They are the host plant for 6 specialist bees, support 112 species of caterpillars and butterflies, caterpillars of moths and butterflies. And they're actually important members of several endemic plant communities and are highly attractive to butterflies and bumblebees. I like to say there's a native aster for pretty much every situation. So shade, sun, wet, dry, and they bloom during the fall when a lot of other flowering species are scarce. As a matter of fact, the one that you see here in the photo is at my old townhouse in Gainesville, and that is aromatic aster, and it was blooming on Halloween. Now that you've seen some examples of some fantastic natives, I just wanted to share with you quickly a project that we did at the Larson Native Plant Garden, so you can see how natives can work together in a tricky spot. Sure, many of you might have this situation in your own backyard, kind of a sunny hillside with crummy soils that gets really baked in the summer and exposed to erosion in the winter. You've tried to plant some things there, nothing seems to want to live. Well, we've got one of these here, obviously at the office, and we decided to install natives that not only survive, but thrive in conditions like these. So, and this is what we created. We created what we call the Sunny Hillside Garden. So you can see it started out as a hot mess, a lot of bare patches of earth, and you can actually see where the water runs off the driveway down the hill. I work with Janet Davis of Hill House Farm and Nursery out of Rappahannock County to develop a plant list for our Sunny Hillside Garden. We're pulling up the existing vegetation, and we put down a layer of hardwood mulch, which will help add some organic matter back to the soil we installed these 7 species of native perennials and grasses. And all of these do well in dry, sunny conditions. Just want to note, though, that dwarf liatris, we took some liberty a little bit with our selections. That one's actually not native to our area of Virginia, so just beware. You'll notice, too, if you're familiar with these species, that none of them grow taller than 2.5 feet tall. That was an intentional aesthetic choice on our part. We didn't really want super tall plants there. And we have a couple that here that are ground cover like plants. So these are the field pussy toes, ragwort, and lyre leaf sage. And then we added native grasses to help hold the soil because that is very important in this spot. And I just want to note, native warm season grasses have incredibly long root systems. For example, little blue stem, which you can see there with the red arrow, can grow up to 5-foot long root systems. And that's not even that long compared to some of the other ones that you can see on the chart. And locally we have other native grasses too that have long root systems, like switchgrass, which is right next to it, which can grow roots up to 8 feet long. I'm just going to click quickly through these. This is just to give you an idea. This was right after we planted this hillside in 2017. Here's a photo from the next year. And, we had some wild columbine that kind of seeded in, and we just kind of let it do its thing, as columbine does. And then here's the slope in the fall. And you can see some aromatic aster blooming, and you have some little blue stem as well. And it creates a very beautiful, visually stunning landscape there. And this brings up another important design point that kind of also factors into supporting wildlife and pollinators. It's important to select natives that have presence or habitat value pretty much all year long, if possible. Pollinators in our region emerge as early as late March, so pretty soon, and are active into November. So, and I can say for sure that the asters in this photo had activity well into the fall. Here's a photo from 2019 of the lyre leaf sage in bloom in the foreground. It's got really beautiful, delicate blooms, and in the background you can see kind of a better view of the smallest ragwort, which is the yellow flower. And I just want to also point out too that if you want to attract pollinators in your landscape, it's really great to have a diverse array of flower shapes, which you can see here, and also flower color. That's really important for attracting diversity of species. And here's the photo from 2019, which kind of just shows what it looks like facing down the hill, and you can see the rest of the Larson garden. And this is pretty much what it looks like now. Between office COVID closure and my maternity leave, I didn't get a photo from the 2020 growing season, but even though the site's almost 5 years old, it's still a work in progress. And I think that's important to realize when you're doing these native landscapes, is that they do evolve over time and they will change, and they need, attention to stay where you want them to. And I know I mentioned a couple of pollinator habitat recommendations. I just wanted to highlight some of them more deliberately. These 3 components, so sun, forage, and nesting opportunities, really make up pollinator habitat. Pollinators are very sensitive to air, temperature, and light changes. So, they're more likely to frequent flowers in sunny areas. However, bees and early butterflies actually use forests in springtime. So in our area, spring bee species will forage on flowering trees and spring ephemerals, pretty close to happening right now. And then once the forest canopy starts to fill in, it becomes more shady and the ephemerals die out and the bees move out of the forest to access some of our late spring flowers that have just emerged. In short, bees and other pollinators use many different types of habitats as long as there are sun and flowers readily available. So keep that in mind. When it comes to nesting sites, being a messy gardener is really key. About 1/3 of North American native bees are ground nesters, and the rest take advantage of various types of cavities. For example, you've probably heard of the blue orchard mason bee, which use dead standing flower stems to lay their eggs in. So it's also important to think too about where bees are hibernating during the winter months. Most of our native bees are solitary, and the queens from these species will hibernate just a few inches under the ground or under leaf litter. So once again, it's okay to be an intentionally neglectful gardener. I always like to say, make sure you leave the leaves and save the snags. So to summarize some of this a little bit more, and I think I've mentioned all of these in one form or another, but just to highlight it, and of course, planting Virginia natives is number one. That's probably the most important thing that you can do for pollinators. But I can't emphasize enough that you want to have some diversity of bloom colors and shape. And that really goes back to what we talked about in the beginning with the different pollinator syndromes and different plants attracting different kinds of pollinators. So you really want to have that available in your landscape. So, and of course, providing cover all year means leaving those leaves, saving the snags, and planting native when you can. And also, just an important plug too, because I did talk about pollinators, how pollinators use forests. Try, if you can, if you have the space, to add trees, flowering trees and shrubs into your mix, because that's going to be really important for bees as they're emerging in the spring. So another thing that is incredibly important to do is to make sure that you select species for pollinators that cover the entire growing season. So this is a great example of 11 species of flowers, just 11 species that can cover the entire season from March to October. I think this list is for the greater Mid-Atlantic region, so some of these plants might not be native to our area, but it's the closest I can find, and I thought it was a pretty good example. So I want to end tonight with the story of purple milkweed and a vision. I gave you an overview earlier of our wetland restoration site at Roundabout Meadows, where we're partnering with Dr. Weeks and her students to record the plant life. A year after we pulled the cattle off the wetland area, and by the way, I just want to mention that we do allow them to graze in a more sustainable fashion in other parts of the farm, I came across this patch of milkweed. And it took me a little bit by surprise because the pink, and this photo doesn't do it justice, but it's so vibrant that I wasn't sure what I was looking at for a minute. I took like 1 million photos and I sent it to a botanist at the Natural Heritage Program who confirmed that it was in fact purple milkweed. And purple milkweed is a rare plant in the Piedmont, and there've only been a couple of verified sightings of it. So it really made me stop and think about the ability of our landscapes to heal themselves if we just allow them to do so. We envision a Piedmont that's connected by rivers and streams, forests, fields, and gardens. A Piedmont where every native plant is one part of the whole, and where we can face climate change with a resilient landscape. Here's Middleburg at sunset. And from this angle, it looks like a lot of other towns in the Piedmont. You've got a vibrant town center, it's surrounded by fields, and then forested mountains. What if each of these 4 green dots represented landowners? It's something for wildlife. Maybe they planted a pollinator garden, improved the riparian buffer, or stopped mowing a field. Then imagine if their neighbors followed suit. And then their neighbors followed suit. What you would get is a little bit more of a connected, resilient landscape. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and I'm going to hand things over to, I believe, Elizabeth for Q&A and door prizes.
Great, Celia. Thank you so much. What a fascinating talk this evening. And we are so thrilled to have been able to partner with the PEC. Before we move on, we do have a few questions. And if any of y'all have additional questions, if you go ahead and enter them into the chat room, we'd love for you to stick around for questions. I understand if you can't, but we have 3 winners that will be receiving Native Virginia Plant Guide. And these books will be mailed to you. So we have Co Eldridge, who is one of our winners, local. Hi, Co. Congratulations. Also, David Burns is our 2nd winner, and Sharon Holmes. So congratulations. We'll be following up with you all and sending and mailing those out to you. Please, again, feel free to go ahead and enter if you have any additional questions. We have several. So Celia, thank you. Again, just it was wonderful and interesting. And I have many questions, and I want you to come to the National Sporting Library Museum as soon as possible and help us. I think we're failing in this area. We definitely can improve. So the first question I have for you is, how do you start a native demonstration garden, and how much space do you need? What is the desired density of the native plants?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it really just depends on, what you're working with. I mean, PUC, we've done gardens that are like 100 square feet, which is pretty tiny. It's like 10 by 10 to, a half acre or more. So there's not really any sort of particular rule of thumb. And I think it sort of depends on what you want your goals to be. What are you trying to demonstrate? Are you trying to show that you can do a lot with short amount of space? Or do you want to create something that's a little bit more dynamic? So there's not really any rule of thumb that way, and it's certainly easier to develop a site where you've already had, like, the ground is already an existing garden bed. I've done it before where we're like cutting turf and moving grass and things like that. It's a little trickier, but you certainly can do it too. And once again, site conditions will kind of dictate on what kind of plants you can put there. And if you're trying to attract birds or pollinators or a mix, those will also kind of, tell you what you want to do in terms of selection for plants.
Great. Thank you. That was a good question.
Mhm.
I know you answered some of this in your talk and gave some recommendations, but this question came in again to please follow up on, where do you suggest shopping for native plants? And if you can't find them, should you start seeds or some type of starter plant?
Oh yeah, I mean, you can do both. I mean, I know folks that will grow their own natives. That's certainly possible. It's a little, if you've got a green thumb already, that's certainly something you can try. Yeah, so I mentioned, just in the, Falk here adjacent. So we've got Piedmont Nursery, which is in Markham. It's owned by Jennifer, I believe you pronounce her last name Say, Jennifer Say. I've worked with her before. We have Watermark Woods, which is in Loudoun County up by Waterford. And then we also have Janet Davis, who owns Hill House Farm and Nursery, which is out in Castleton and Rappahannock. And those are kind of the closest ones. And there's one or two more in Northern Virginia and in Charlottesville, but those are probably your best bet in terms of trying to buy something local.
Great. Thank you. Where's the best place to buy more mature native trees, in your opinion?
Well, there's always Grelin Nursery. Grelin kind of specializes in large size trees, and they've also got this pretty impressive tree spade, so they can come out and install it for you. And they have non-native, but they also have a lot of natives as well. They're usually our go-to people, and they actually donated some trees that we used here at the office.
Oh yeah, that's a great spot, and you can actually, the wonderful trails, you can hike there from Montpelier and get some exercise, and hike all the way up there and walk through all their wonderful gardens.
Yes, it's a great day trip.
So another question, we live in an HOA with dense urban design and not much land. Has PEC met with any of the HOAs, and if so, have you had any success in increasing awareness?
Yes. That's actually the focus of my one of my coworkers, Jem Bingle, who is our land use representative in Loudoun County. And I've also worked with a couple of HOAs in Fauquier County as well, and also Albemarle. It's really a mixed bag. I think it greatly depends on the willingness of the people. Usually, most HOAs have a governing body, they have a landscape committee. And those are really the people that can affect major change in terms of the common areas. And if you've got some like-minded people on those committees, or maybe you can get yourself onto those committees and help a little bit, it can work. And, Jem has really done some amazing things with some, open-minded HOAs in Loudoun County. And I've done some with Fauquier as well, but I've also, had some obstacles, so it sort of depends.
Great, thank you. What native species do you recommend for a novice to start with, if you just wanted to pick several?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on what your site conditions are, because the big thing, and I didn't say it too much here, but with natives, it's really about picking the right plant for the right place. So you want to make sure that you pick, you know, for the sunny hillside garden that we have at the office, like we were looking for plants that can handle that. So it sort of depends on that. But if you're just talking about sunny garden, you know, you can't go wrong with asters. You know, I think little blue stem as a grass is a really nice ornamental one. You always want to have some milkweed in there, maybe swamp milkweed or butterfly weed. You know, once again, it sort of depends, but the Piedmont Native Plant Guide is a really good place to start because those plants are pretty tried and true, and it shouldn't steer you wrong.
Great, thank you, Celia. I think this will be our last question. Can you recommend landscape designers, architects who can help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sort of depends on where you live. I know most folks are in the Middleburg area, but you know, one landscape designer I know in particular is John McGee. So John McGee Design, he actually lives in Middleburg, and you know, he's a very skilled designer. Elizabeth Miera, who's out of Northern Virginia. I'm blanking on the name of her business, but she's also really excellent. And Janet Davis of Hill House Nursery will do some designs as well, but she sort of depends on her capacity. I will say too that PEC has a guide. It's a little outdated. It's called Go Native, Go Local. And if you go onto our website, you can see it. And last print was in 2015. So some businesses may not still be in business at this point, but it does have lists of nurseries, native nurseries, and some landscape designers too that you can look at.
Great, thank you. I also like to mention in the Middleburg area, Nina Fout also is a
Yes, good recommendation.
Person also, and someone just mentioned in the chat room, Hummingbird Hill Nursery.
Yes, that they're down in the Charlottesville area, but they are excellent as well.
Great. Well, I'm just looking, we've had such a great talk this evening. And again, sincerely, thank you so much, Celia. Thank you to Valerie, Marco, and Chris Miller, PEC. It's wonderful to partner with you all. We look forward to our upcoming talk on brook trout, which shall be exciting also. And again, thank you, everyone. If you were one of our lucky winners, we will follow up and mail your books to you shortly. Thank you. Chris,
thanks everyone.
Now, if you wanted to add anything.
Just my thanks. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Valerie, and just everyone for staying connected, and really hope that you take advantage of the guides and any information we can provide. But thanks so much for being here tonight.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and good evening.